Now here we go to the Jackson Presidency. Okay, this is section 7.3 and 7.4 in your textbook. We're going to kind of go through it pretty briefly here. Our objectives are identify the events and factors that contribute to Andrew Jackson's rise to power. Right, and we'll also go kind of the social, political, and economic impact that Jackson had on the United States of America. And you can really say, for better or worse, Andrew Jackson is one of the most impactful presidents that we've had.
Absolutely. So where we're going to begin is we're going to begin with the election of 1824. Beginning in 1800 to 1808, we have Thomas Jefferson. From 1808 to 1816, through the War of 1812, James Madison. And then after James Madison, for 8 years, we had his Secretary of State, James Monroe. Well, next up is James Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. Now, this time, Andrew Jackson has finished his military career. He is retired, but he is motivated by what he sees as rampant corruption in the government. He wants to run for president so he can help clean up the United States of America. And in the election of 1824, what we see is many of the votes are split between 4 different candidates. Now, a brief look at the results in the election of 1824 would show that Andrew Jackson won, and he should be president. But as we found out in the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied, the vote went to the House of Representatives. That's because neither of them had a majority. 51% of the electoral votes is how many you need to automatically become president. Not the most, like Andrew Jackson had, but 51%. So because Andrew Jackson did not receive 51%, just like in the election or revolution of 1800, the vote goes to the House of Representatives.
All right. Now remember, Henry Clay, who is one of the candidates for president, has a pretty poor showing in the election, but he's going to play a very pivotal role in this because he is the Speaker of the House and has a lot of sway over the representatives there.
So the election of 1824 is nicknamed the corrupt bargain, and this is why. The vote goes to the House of Representatives. It is between Jackson, Quincy Adams, and Clay. Crawford has passed away, so now there are only 3 candidates to vote for. Clay, having a lot of influence in the House, but realizing it's probably not practical for him to run, decides to drop out of the race. Now it's just Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. But what Clay does with that influence that Mr. Manelsky mentioned he had, he convinces the House of Representatives to vote for his buddy, John Quincy Adams. Now that alone would frustrate Andrew Jackson. He feels like the presidency has been taken from him. But you can see how John or Andrew Jackson would admit, well, Henry Clay thought John Quincy Adams was the better candidate. He threw his support behind him. Maybe I lost fair and square. But that's not the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain is when it later comes out that Henry Clay, the man who dropped out and threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, is now the new Secretary of State. That's extremely important in the United States at this time, because Thomas Jefferson was John Adams' Secretary of State. James Madison was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. James Monroe was James Madison's Secretary of State, and John Quincy Adams was James Monroe's Secretary of State. 4 presidents in a row have gone from Secretary of State to President. Andrew Jackson feels like John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay made a collusive deal. They had a corrupt bargain to make Quincy Adams president and put Clay next in line to be president.
All right, so Jackson, not one to back down from a challenge or let a grudge go unsettled, decides, and him and his supporters decide to basically change the rules for an election for the next presidential election, okay? So at this time, most states have pretty limited voting rights. You have to own property, you have to be a certain age, and it's very different today where you have universal, anyone over 18 can just go vote. In the 1824 election, there were property requirements, there were wealth requirements. It was very hard to vote. Only about 350,000 people actually cast ballots in the 1824 election, which helped Adams because the wealthier, more elitist people who supported Adams were going to have a much larger share of the electorate, people voting. So Jacksonian Republicans, later become the Jacksonian Democrats, start to get laws changed in states, voting laws changed, expanding the electorate, expanding the right to vote, especially in western and southern states.
And this is important to keep in mind what Mr. Minelski mentioned. I don't know why this pen never works with yours. But what Mr. Minelski mentioned is these Jacksonian Republicans eventually become Jacksonian Democrats. So by the time Andrew Jackson emerges victorious, you have National Republicans and Jacksonian Democrats. And we'll talk more about the process as we move forward. But this election for 1828, this campaign was over a 3-year campaign. Jackson and his men went throughout all the southern states and convinced their legislatures to lower those voting requirements, knowing it would favor Andrew Jackson. And it definitely did. And the election of 1828, it was Andrew Jackson, the common man, versus John Quincy Adams, the wealthy, pampered, spoiled elitist, who basically had his way paid for him from the time he was only about 9 or 10 years old, growing up with Vice President and then President John Adams.
You could say it's not like Trump versus Jeb Bush.
Yeah, to a point, absolutely, right?
Also, the 1820 election becomes a really nasty election, right? The press, people talk about how partisan the press is today. Back then, like, the parties had their own newspapers that kind of print whatever they wanted, right? Freedom of speech. Jackson's wife was accused of being a polygamist because technically she was. Horrible things about John Quincy Adams' time in Russia when his father was ambassador. Kind of these scandals would be dragged up or made up during the election. Brutal campaigning.
But Andrew Jackson ends up winning, and he ends up winning in a landslide. And if anything represents the common man Andrew Jackson, it was the inauguration party that happened when he was elected. At this time, during inaugurations, they would just open the White House up to anyone. So people traveled for weeks from Kentucky and the Carolinas and Tennessee, from all over to see their man, Andrew Jackson, being elected president. Things got a little out of control. There was a 10-foot wheel of cheese. There was liquor all over the place, people literally swinging from the chandeliers, and that is when the White House decided opening the White House up to inaugurations is not the best idea.
He couldn't even sleep in the White House his first night as president because they wouldn't leave or stop.
Yeah, and it was totally
go stay at a hotel.
But this shows who Andrew Jackson appeals to and reinforces next slide, how important the expansion of democracy is. So we went from about 350,000 people voting in the corrupt bargain of 1824 to 1.15 million people voting in the next election. And you notice all these areas that they expanded the white man's ability to vote by lowering voting requirements overwhelmingly went for Jackson.
So you can see the difference here is we're going to see the sectionalism too, right? The South, Jackson was a slave owner, he's from Tennessee, he's holding that Southern power there, right? And that's going to keep exacerbating itself as the elections go on.
So, as Jackson becomes president, there are quite a few controversies that follow with him. He's very jaded after losing in the election in 1824. He feels like he's been screwed out of the presidency. So what he does is he takes on this attitude of, if I win, I get to do whatever I want with my victory. The spoil system comes from the idea, to the victor go the spoils. The man who wins gets to reap the benefit of his victory. And when Andrew Jackson wins presidency, he basically puts all of his friends into office, and so much so that he avoids dealing with the cabinet that the Senate has approved of, and instead he seeks advice from his friends, who were not approved of by the Senate, avoiding checks and balances. This is known as the spoil system. It was very frowned upon, but to Jackson, he said, well, you know what? If I'm going to get cheated out of an election, I'm going to do whatever I want when I eventually win. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 is probably the biggest black eye of Jefferson's presidency. Up to this point, many presidents have been in favor of removing the Native Americans, all the way from Jefferson to Madison to Monroe, and even John Quincy Adams to a point. But none of them had actually tried to do it. Well, Andrew Jackson believed this is something the American people want, so I am actually going to do it. Additionally, we're 33 years removed from the invention of the cotton gin. We talked in 7.1 and into 7.2 about how crucially important slavery was in the South and how it was becoming entrenched. Well, because of this, the Southerners needed more land for slavery. So, what that means is round up the Native Americans who were living on that land and ship them west. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was deemed unconstitutional by John Marshall, but Andrew Jackson, ever the firebrand, ignored that decision and said John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Showing a huge gap in checks and balances, the executive, for all intents and purposes, can ignore a Supreme Court ruling if he really wants to, and nothing can actually be done about it.
And Jackson wasn't all about states' rights and then ignored following the federal government. When it came to nullification, when something didn't go his way, he responded pretty harshly. He passes a tariff, and a tariff again is a tax on imports and exports, and this is going to affect Southerners much more than it was going to affect Northerners. It was a tariff on cotton, and South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, who's actually Jackson's vice president, doesn't really like that. He thinks the North and the West are targeting the South, raising money at the expense of the South for benefits like canals and roads and things that are generally going to help the North and the West. So John C. Calhoun believes that South Carolina doesn't have to follow the law, and if it does, it will succeed from the Union. Jackson doesn't really like Calhoun anyway, and when he does that, Jackson threatens to send the army down and forcefully enforces federal law there. So it really, over the states, Jackson enforces the law when he wants to, not when it's constitutional.
And real quick, before Mr. Manelsky moves on to the bank war, the idea of nullification, if we remember, is that a state doesn't have to follow federal law if it doesn't want to. This came from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions after the Alien and Sedition Act. But the big thing here, and why John C. Calhoun is so angry about this tariff, is he knows deep down, and this is what people didn't really realize at the time, if he can't stop the federal government from enforcing a tariff, then eventually what will ever allow a southern state to stop the federal government from maybe getting rid of or limiting slavery in the United States. So the dark cloud of slavery is hovering over this entire debate for nullification.
Basically everything that happens between 1810 and 1850 has something to do with slavery. In some way or the other, right? The bank war, this goes to Jackson's man of the people, the common man persona he had. He thought the national bank was bad. He thought it benefited the rich and the elite that he had ran his presidential campaign against. So Jackson decides to veto the rechartering of the national bank when the Congress had repassed it. This creates financial havoc in the country. Banks are important for the expansion of business, the expansion of credit, allowing the economy to grow. A lot of that credit dried up, especially after Jackson took all the money from the government and put it into these much less stable wildcat banks that were kind of run by his friends in the States.
And one thing real quick for you guys, if you're confused about the bank war, if you want more details on the bank war, check out the video Mr. Manelsky and I posted, the video activity. Watch the one on the bank war because it will really help explain just what the problem was. But it really goes down to the fact that Jackson thought the bank was benefiting the rich and the privileged. Therefore, he wanted to get rid of the bank. But then, of course, the economy ran amok without a federal bank to control it. Well, guys, Mr. Manelsky had to head to class, so I will wrap up the lecture on 7.3 and 7.4 in the next couple minutes right now. Following Andrew Jackson's presidency, his hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, ends up winning the election of 1836, becoming the 8th president of the United States of America. We left off on the last slide talking about how the destruction of the second bank of the United States and the lack of stability in the American economic system is going to lead to an economic collapse. And that's exactly what happens. But while it was precipitated by Andrew Jackson, it happened during Van Buren's presidency. So he's the one that's going to take most of, if not all, of the blame for this. And that's what the Panic of 1837 was. The state banks so when Jackson shut down the second bank of the United States, he took a lot of the deposits and put them into various state banks throughout the United States. But there's no oversight on these state banks. There's no one checking in to make sure that they're being responsible with their money. So they started loaning out far too much money to people, which made inflation skyrocket. The value of the dollar is going down because there's too much money in the economy. Andrew Jackson, always one who hated paper money, decided he is going to fix this problem. If you wanted to pay back a loan, you had to do it with gold or silver. You had to do it with actual money. But here's the issue. All these farmers who took out loans to buy land didn't plan on having to pay it back with real money. They planned on paying it back with paper money. So everyone runs to the bank to get all of their hard coin out of the bank, and then the bank runs out of hard coin. And you have people who have money in the bank, but they don't anymore because these wildcat or state banks ended up giving away all the hard coin money, and the paper money is worthless. So the economy goes into a deep depression. Because of that, Martin Van Buren is not re-elected president, and in 1840, William Henry Harrison wins the election. Now, one thing that's interesting here is we talked about how the Republican Party will die away temporarily, because we know it comes back with Abraham Lincoln in the 1860 election. But it temporarily dies away. And while Andrew Jackson is killing the National Bank, removing the Native Americans, crushing nullification, he has a lot of enemies. And those enemies decide they're going to create a new political party. They will name it the Whig Party. It reminds us a lot of the National Republicans, the Federalists. A lot of the Northeasterners liked the Whig Party. It was more tied to business and merchants. But they named themselves the Whig Party because the Whig Party in Britain existed to oppose the king. So just by naming it the Whig Party, they're basically insulting Andrew Jackson and saying he's acting like a king. And their man, William Henry Harrison, wins. Another hero from the War of 1812. He's a hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. And he brings his Vice President, John Tyler, with him. And they have the phrase Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And they end up winning the election of 1840 on that phrase. Now, just like Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison's a war hero of 1812, but also just like Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison and the Whig Party fancy himself a man of the people. At this point, as we mentioned, newspapers and politicians can say and write whatever they want because there's no one to fact check them. And that's what William Henry Harrison did. He was an extremely wealthy, privileged man who claimed to be a man of the people like Andrew Jackson or Martin Van Buren definitely was not. But William Henry Harrison will die 1 month into office, and John Tyler will take over. And John Tyler will lead America much more like a Democrat than like the Whig William Henry Harrison does. Thanks for watching the lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask your history.